As of 2025, a large share of baby boomers still remain in the workforce, and many of them are not leaving by choice. Instead, they're being pushed into retirement years earlier than they planned. In this video, I'll show you 3 immediate costs of being forced out: running out of money sooner than expected, losing affordable healthcare before Medicare kicks in, and hitting a wall in the job market. Many boomers lack sufficient savings to handle an abrupt exit. The typical retirement account balance is far below what financial independence actually requires. And that's where the real story begins. Retirement stops being a choice. The moment retirement stops being a choice. Retirement was never designed to unfold this way. For decades, it carried the image of a hard-earned reward. The end of steady years of work marked by farewells, reflections, and the chance to finally focus on family, hobbies, or travel. But that picture no longer matches reality. Today, retirement for many baby boomers isn't marked by a chosen timeline, but by circumstances outside their control. About 15% of the U.S. labor force in 2024 was made up of boomers, and surveys from Transamerica show a large share expected to work past 65. Yet what we're actually seeing is employers steering those timelines through restructuring, downsizing, and technology shifts that leave workers with little say. One scene illustrates the pattern clearly. A long-tenured employee arrives for what seems like an ordinary Friday, only to be called into a brief meeting and handed separation paperwork. By the afternoon, they leave carrying a box with desk items, walking out not from choice, but from a company-wide decision. It's abrupt and disorienting, and while the details vary from worker to worker, the story has become familiar enough that it no longer feels like anecdote, it feels like routine. Behind these exits are predictable forces rather than accidents or isolated acts. Corporate restructuring plays an outsized role. Companies under pressure to stay competitive often frame these decisions as streamlining moves or as aligning to new strategies. That framing is partly true, but it also means specific individuals, often with decades of service, are suddenly unneeded. A department once considered central can vanish after one management meeting, not because the work lacked value, but because budgets and markets shifted. For the individual whose security was rooted in that role, it leaves no option but early retirement, whether planned or not. Automation adds another dimension. NBR research has shown that increased computerization in workplaces has historically raised retirement probabilities, especially among older workers. As tasks are automated or digital tools become central to operations, higher-paid senior employees may be seen as less cost-effective for the functions that remain. Even if experienced workers are capable of adapting, companies often prefer younger staff who can do the redefined jobs at lower salaries. It isn't always a question of willingness, but of perception. Firms see efficiency mostly in financial terms, not institutional memory or adaptability. Cost pressures are equally significant. By the time workers reach their 60s, they frequently carry salaries and benefits higher than those paid to younger colleagues. Healthcare premiums in particular make older employees stand out in budget reviews. For executives tasked with trimming expenses, these numbers matter more than loyalty, proficiency, or tenure. Ironically, long service that once seemed like a guarantee of stability now makes workers the most expensive line items, placing them first on the list when cuts are discussed. The outcome has been a steady rise in retirements that are not voluntary. Transamerica's reports show many older workers intend to extend their careers, but workforce realities contradict those intentions. Across industries, finance, retail, construction, even education, exits are triggered less by personal readiness and more by external forces. A teacher near retirement age might be nudged toward early incentive packages. A construction veteran might find younger crews labeled more fit for the job and hired at lower wages. An engineer with decades on the job may hear that their role no longer matches the company's future direction. None of these cases point to a single master plan against older workers. Instead, they reflect overlapping factors, economic, technological, and cost-driven, that converge to shrink options. The changes reach both white-collar and blue-collar employment. Nurses in healthcare report being subtly reassigned until stepping down becomes the only practical move. Office professionals find promotions disappearing and workloads reduced, making continued employment unsustainable. Skilled tradespeople face similar dismissals framed in terms of efficiency or endurance. The consistent thread is that hard work and loyalty no longer guarantee that. ability to choose when to retire. For many, the emotional toll is as destabilizing as the financial impact. Plans to retire alongside a spouse or to wait until children finish school vanish in an afternoon. The sense of conclusion that used to come with retirement, the ability to write one's own final chapter, has been replaced with uncertainty and loss. Workers describe the experience less as finishing a journey and more as being told to stop mid-course. That shift erodes not just security but dignity. These trends now appear common enough to suggest a new normal. For late-stage boomers, the expectation of controlling the timing of retirement is less realistic with each passing year. Data shows a substantial share are exiting earlier than they intended, reshaping retirement from an earned milestone to something closer to an externally imposed deadline. Once pushed out, re-entry into the workforce at a comparable level is rare, making the transition effectively permanent. The result is a generation reaching the end of their careers in ways that look profoundly different from the story many assumed. They prepared for retirement as if it would be voluntary, yet the reality is that external pressures have taken that choice away. What's striking is that these are not isolated hardships, but part of a broader pattern affecting thousands across industries at the same time. And it raises a crucial question. If years of expertise, proven track records, and decades of commitment no longer secure job stability, then what calculations are companies actually using to decide who stays and who goes? That is where the real explanation begins. Why companies are quietly pushing out boomers. You might expect decades of accumulated experience to make an employee indispensable. Someone in their 60s has worked through recessions, adapted to multiple waves of new technology, and managed organizational upheavals that younger coworkers only know from textbooks. They carry lessons that could help a team avoid repeating past mistakes. Yet these same workers are often among the first to be dismissed. Why? The answer has less to do with capability than with the way companies calculate value today. In modern boardrooms, experience often gets translated into higher costs, and when paired with budget constraints, it begins to look less like an asset and more like a financial risk. The strongest driver behind this trend is simple economics. Many baby boomers earn the highest wages in their departments, reflecting decades of raises and promotions on a traditional career ladder. When earnings reports come in, executives scanning payrolls see those salaries as an easy lever to reduce costs. One senior employee's compensation can equal the cost of 2 or 3 new hires, which on a spreadsheet makes downsizing appear efficient. Cutting veteran staff allows managers to report immediate savings without explaining more complex fixes to investors. For older employees, that calculation translates into pink slips. Research from Transamerica reinforces this financial pressure, noting that many workers remain in the labor force longer than expected because their own retirement savings cannot cover living costs if they stop working too soon, creating tension between their need to stay and the company's incentive to cut costs. Salary is only part of the expense. Benefits matter just as much, if not more. Health insurance premiums rise significantly with age, and employers must pay more to cover older employees whether or not they use the healthcare system. A 63-year-old in excellent health still costs the company more than a 28-year-old, simply because insurers expect greater medical risk. Across a large workforce, this added expense becomes difficult to ignore, and it tips the balance when executives weigh whom to keep. Even international studies, such as Manulife's research on how employers are reevaluating retirement supports, note this financial tension as one of the forces reshaping workplace demographics. Beyond dollars, there are perceptions that work against older employees. Fast-moving industries assume that younger staff members, described as digital natives, can adapt more quickly to new tools, apps, or platforms. In sectors like finance, logistics, and marketing, the arrival of artificial intelligence, data analytics, and cloud systems has widened that perception gap. Managers often believe that boomers will be slower to adapt, or worse, that they resist change altogether. Even when older employees take initiatives, joining training sessions, self-studying, or gaining certifications, they are often overlooked because the stereotype already lingers. In practical terms, this means a younger colleague is more likely to be offered a retraining assignment, while a 60-something is offered early retirement or severance. Technology itself complicates the situation. The NBR has shown that waves of computerization in the last few decades disproportionately affected older workers, accelerating retirements in industries where automation reshaped tasks. Similar questions now surround artificial intelligence. Some roles traditionally held by older workers are highly automatable, like data processing or standardized clerical tasks. At the same time, newer studies from Stanford and ADP suggest AI disruption also hits younger, entry-level jobs, since those are often structured around routine work that software can replace. The truth is more nuanced than a simple AI pushes out older workers. Automation is reshaping job requirements across all age groups, but for boomers nearing retirement, the result is sharper. Fewer retraining opportunities, limited chance to switch career tracks, and company assumptions that they are already at the end of their professional road. Hiring practices also reinforce this divide. Younger employees are not only cheaper, but also more likely to be framed as having long-term potential. Human resources offices define culture fit in ways that emphasize energy, flexibility, and adaptability, all qualities implicitly coded as youthful. While no HR policy explicitly forbids hiring older staff, these preferences guide decisions about who gets interviews, roles, and promotions. A 25-year-old is considered the future of the company, while a 62-year-old is viewed as nearing the end, even when the latter may still want and need to work another decade. As recent studies highlight, employers increasingly tie workforce planning to long-term strategic visions, which means that anyone not seen as part of that future has limited prospects. Legal protections exist, but they remain uneven. In the United States, age discrimination has been against the law for decades under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. However, enforcement is difficult, and cases are often challenging to prove. In early 2025, lawmakers reintroduced the Protecting Older Workers Against Discrimination Act, POADA, which aims to strengthen claims processes for victims, though it remains only a proposal for now. Internationally, some jurisdictions provide clearer guidance. For example, Ontario's Human Rights Commission explicitly mandates non-discrimination in employment decisions based on age. Still, even where protections exist, the subtler forms of bias, embedding energy or cultural fit into hiring criteria, rarely trigger legal consequences, leaving older workers exposed. For businesses, these moves are explained not as bias, but as practical necessity. Employers operate in environments where quarter-to-quarter performance determines stock prices and executive bonuses. Rising labor costs, shrinking margins, and volatile markets all increase the pressure to trim expenses quickly. Cutting high-salary employees in their 60s often provides the fastest budget relief. From the company's vantage point, it is about survival, not personal animosity. But for the individuals pushed out, it results in sudden instability, lost income, and a forced retirement they did not plan for. The deeper problem is what gets measured. Intangible strengths, mentorship, decision-making informed by decades of trial and error, or steady leadership through crises, are hard to quantify. In contrast, salaries, benefits, and measurable task completion rates are easy to log, chart, and display at a board meeting. This imbalance means the qualities that make older workers valuable go unseen, while the numbers that make them look expensive become front and center. It is less that management dismisses experience outright, and more that it fails to appear in the categories where decisions are made. Because of that, experience often shifts from being seen as an asset to being regarded as excess baggage. Once that perception takes hold, older workers become the first targets whenever companies restructure. Their higher compensation and benefit costs overshadow their actual performance or expertise. What managers describe as strategic planning or competitive restructuring frequently disguises a straightforward choice. Cut the staff who cost the most, even if they also contribute the most institutional knowledge. It becomes a consistent pattern where loyalty and capability cannot outweigh numbers on a budget report. This explains why the pace of forced retirements has accelerated. Employers present these decisions as part of modernization or efficiency strategies, but the underlying reasons repeat: salaries at their peak, healthcare premiums at their highest, and assumptions of limited adaptability. For baby boomers, this creates an environment where working past 60 becomes increasingly rare, not because of disinterest, but because companies close the door first. The outcome is shaped less by attitude or ambition, and more by forces embedded in how businesses define value. And while this explains why so many boomers are leaving the workforce earlier than intended, it also raises another urgent concern: The reality is that many of these workers did not expect to stop earning so soon. They planned for retirement on the assumption they would leave voluntarily, with years left to build extra savings. When those plans collapse, they face an even more sobering issue. The accounts they have spent decades building often fall short of what they truly need to live on. Next, we'll look at the hard numbers most people miss. Why savings and safety nets are not what you think. The retirement accounts that weren't enough. For years, we assumed that baby boomers had every advantage when it came to retirement. They were the most college-educated generation up to that point. They entered the workforce during decades of strong post-war growth, and many bought homes before housing prices exploded. On paper, it looked like a recipe for broad financial security. Yet as of 2025, the reality for most is sobering. Retirement accounts are much thinner than people realize, and for a large portion of boomers, they barely resemble a safety net at all. The core issue is that the wealth tied to this generation is unevenly distributed. Research from Transamerica reports that the median retirement savings for boomers who have managed to accumulate accounts sits around $270,000. That may sound like a large figure, but over a retirement that can stretch 30 years, it is far from sufficient. And those numbers only reflect the middle of the distribution. Roughly 1 in 3 older Americans, according to Go Banking Rates and Bar, have little to no retirement savings at all. This division within the same generation tells the true story. Some boomers are doing fine, but millions are facing retirements with virtually no private cushion. A major structural shift explains much of this outcome. In the 1970s and 1980s, employers began phasing out pensions in favor of 401k style accounts. Pensions had guaranteed income for life, as long as workers stayed with their company. By contrast, 401k's placed the responsibility squarely on individuals to contribute, invest wisely, and ride out decades of market cycles. Younger employees who began saving early had time to let compounding work in their favor. But late boomers were already in mid-career when this transition took hold. Entering the system in their 30s or 40s left them with fewer years of compounding, and many never made up the difference. For them, the financial rules changed mid-game, and the impact is permanent. This pension to 401k switch created a two-track reality even within the boomer generation itself. Early boomers, born in the late 1940s or early 1950s, often kept some pension benefits while also tapping into newer accounts. Late boomers, born in the 1960s, were caught in between. They often ended up with a patchwork of small accounts spread across multiple employers, and no pension to provide a baseline guarantee. The result, decades later, is smaller balances that fail to match the promises pensions once delivered. The timing of economic crises compounded these problems. The Great Recession that began in 2008 hit late boomers during their peak earning years. Researchers at Boston College and Transamerica both document that incomes and savings for this group suffered lasting declines. For those in their 50s, the damage was almost impossible to undo. Job losses meant halted contributions, and some workers resorted to early 401k withdrawals that permanently reduced balances. Although markets eventually recovered, the lost years of compounding left retirement accounts far smaller than they otherwise would have been. Just a little over a decade later came the pandemic shock of 2020. Many older workers lost jobs, and a significant share never re-entered the workforce. Some drained savings to cover immediate expenses. Others paused contributions permanently. For people in their 60s, the recovery period was not long enough to rebuild what evaporated in that short, turbulent stage. While younger workers had time on their side, older boomers found themselves locked out of the rebound. The result across the generation has been striking. While headlines often note that baby boomers still hold significant aggregate wealth, much of that is concentrated in the highest income households or tied up in home equity. For middle-class boomers, retirement accounts look more like emergency funds than true nest eggs. Imagine spending 40 years in the workforce and reaching retirement with only $30,000 or $40,000 put aside. At safe withdrawal rates of about 3 to 4% per year, that translates into a yearly sum too small to cover even groceries, let alone housing or healthcare. This distribution gap often gets masked when commentators rely on averages. Average balances are lifted upward by the wealthiest households, retirees with millions saved. But the median, which represents the typical saver, lands far lower. For many, the balance they've accumulated over decades, will sustain only a year or two of basic living expenses. Put bluntly, what looks like a lifetime of work has resulted in too little to bridge the decades many boomers will live after leaving employment. The problem grows sharper when viewed alongside Social Security. For most, it will be the foundational source of income. But the benefit amount depends heavily on the timing of when people file. If someone claims benefits as early as age 62 instead of at the full retirement age of 67, the monthly check falls dramatically. The Social Security Administration's projections show this clearly. A benefit worth about $1,930 at 67 shrinks to roughly $1,342 at 62. That reduction is permanent, and for those with small savings accounts, it leaves their retirement budgets thinner every month for the rest of their lives. This shortfall makes involuntary retirement especially punishing. If boomers had entered this stage with strong balances, a forced exit from the workforce would have been inconvenient but survivable. Instead, leaving the job market in their 60s often eliminates their last chance to build up those accounts. It leaves households with shallow savings, reduced Social Security benefits if taken early, and costs that continue to climb. Some boomers adapt by cutting back wherever they can. Households downsize, move to less expensive cities, or cut discretionary spending sharply. While these strategies stretch budgets, they cannot multiply existing savings into something more sustainable. A modest account balance is still a modest account balance, no matter how aggressively it is rationed. Without the time left to rebuild contributions or capture compounding, these efforts are limited to making do rather than creating security. What's important to recognize is that this outcome was not simply a matter of individuals failing to plan. Boomers faced stagnant wages in many industries, medical expenses that absorbed large chunks of paychecks, and housing markets that escalated dramatically. They watched retirement systems flip from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution plans, just as they were arriving at mid-career. And they endured two major financial crises that interrupted saving right when they could least afford it. Even diligent savers found themselves falling behind under these conditions. When we zoom out across the entire generation, the numbers speak clearly. The median savings figure is too low to guarantee independence. A third of older Americans report having no retirement account at all. For forced retirees, that means stepping into retirement not with the power of choice, but with almost no financial options. They are left with Social Security alone, or with minimal savings that cannot sustain the lifestyle they had pictured.